Caleb sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with silence as his father sipped his coffee across from him. Thomas was a stern, unreadable man, a father of few words. Life with him had been a constant stream of chores, routines, and expectations. Caleb was used to weird requests from him, like fixing the roof before dinner or organizing the tool shed in perfect alphabetical order. But tonight would be different. Thomas folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. "I need you to do something for me, Caleb," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Caleb blinked, curious and uneasy. It wasn't unusual for his father to ask for help, but this time something about his tone made his skin prickle. "What kind of thing?" Thomas leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You have to promise not to tell anyone, not ever." The kitchen lights buzzed faintly, and Caleb felt the air shift, heavy with the weight of whatever his father was about to say. "Okay," he said cautiously. "I won't tell." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Tomorrow after school you'll meet me at the old cabin in the woods. Bring your baseball bat." "The bat?" "Why?" Caleb asked, the unease spreading through him like a cold wave. Thomas's eyes darkened. "Just trust me. It's time for you to learn what I've been doing all these years." The next afternoon, Caleb trudged through the woods, gripping the bat tightly. The old cabin stood at the edge of the forest, a relic from a time long gone. Its roof sagged, and the windows were covered in dust and ivy. His father was already waiting at the door, his hands in his pockets. "You came?" Thomas said, as if it were the only thing that mattered. "You didn't give me much choice," Caleb replied, his heart thudding against his ribs. Thomas gestured toward the door. "Come inside." The cabin smelled like damp wood and something faintly sour. In the center of the room sat an old radio on a small table. Caleb frowned. "What's this?" His father walked over to the radio, brushing dust off the knobs with the reverence of someone handling an ancient artifact. "This," Thomas said, "is what I need you to use." Caleb stared, baffled. "You called me here for an old radio?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "It's not just a radio. It's a way to communicate, to keep things in balance." "Balance?" Caleb echoed, not understanding. "Every week at exactly 5:55 p.m. you tune it to the right frequency. You don't speak, you just listen, and you never ever change the station." Caleb's heart raced. "Why do you listen to it? What's on the other side?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Questions don't help, Caleb. Just do as I say." The following week, Caleb sat alone in the cabin, his hands trembling as he turned the knobs on the radio. It was 5:55 p.m. and static crackled through the speakers like the sound of distant whispers. Then, just as his father had warned, a voice emerged, soft and melodic, like a lullaby sung through layers of static. It wasn't a human voice, and it wasn't speaking in a language Caleb knew, but the sound wrapped around him, pulling at the edges of his mind like a forgotten memory trying to surface. Caleb sat frozen, his bat resting uselessly on his lap. The voice was strange but not frightening, more comforting, like it had always been waiting for him. When the clock hit 6 p.m, the voice disappeared and the radio went silent again. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Weeks turned into months, and Caleb kept returning to the cabin, sitting in front of the radio every Monday evening at the same time. He never told anyone about the voice, just like his father had instructed. But the more he listened, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that the voice knew him, that it was speaking to him. One evening, after the usual broadcast ended, Caleb couldn't help himself. He reached for the radio knob, heart pounding. His father's warning rang in his ears, never change the station, but curiosity gnawed at him. He wanted to know what else was out there. With a quick, shaky turn, Caleb adjusted the dial just slightly. At first there was nothing but silence. Then a new voice came through, a voice that sounded like his own. "Hello? Is someone there?" Caleb gasped, the bat slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. He leaned in closer to the radio. Who are you?" "I'm Caleb," the voice replied, filled with confusion. "Who are—" The air seemed to press in on him, heavy and suffocating. Caleb stared at the radio in disbelief. It was his own voice, but how? "Where are you?" Caleb whispered, his throat dry. "I'm at the cabin," the other voice said. "Dad told me to come here and listen to the radio." Caleb's heart stopped. He was in the cabin, right now. He scrambled backward, his breath shallow, as a terrible realization took hold. This wasn't just a weird task. The radio wasn't a harmless device, it was a doorway. Between realities, between versions of himself. He clutched his head, trying to make sense of it all. Had his father known about this? How many versions of Caleb were there? Had he been swapping places with them every time he listened to the broadcast? Suddenly, the door to the cabin creaked open. Caleb turned, expecting to see his father, but standing there was himself, another Caleb. The other boy smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "Dad said it's my turn now." Before Caleb could react, the other boy stepped inside, reached for the radio dial and turned it back to the original station. The voice, the same soft, melodic one, returned, filling the room like a lullaby. And just like that, the world shifted. Caleb blinked and found himself standing outside the cabin, the door shut tight behind him. Through the cracked window he could see the other Caleb sitting inside, listening to the radio. Life now. Caleb pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. He shouted, but no one heard him. From the trees a voice echoed, his father's voice, low and regretful. "I told you, son. Some things you don't ask about, some burdens you carry alone." And with that, Caleb realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't the original, he never had been. He was just one version, one of many. And now he was on the outside where no one would ever find him again.